I've had a lot of classes right after lunch, and so I'm used to people falling into a confused slumber. If necessary, feel free. Anyway, what I want to do now is actually, we've looked at a number of different things that really set the groundwork for the discussion of resistance theory. You need to have in place ideas like unalienable rights, like limitations on government. You need to have some of the church-state stuff in place. You need covenant theory. You need all these kinds of things that we've talked about. And together, they will set up the question of what do you do if the government oversteps its bounds? And particularly, what do you do if the government oversteps its bounds in a way that's really serious? I mean, there's a certain degree of overreach that's going to happen that you can safely ignore. What happens when it gets past the point of safety? That's what Protestant resistance theory is designed to answer. Now, we got to go back to the Lutherans here. We ended up with the Reformed. Let's go back to the Lutherans. What's the situation? Well, Luther nails the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. His students look at this and say, oh man, this is hot stuff. And so they copy it down, they translate it into German so that the common people can read it, and then they take it to a printer. And it rapidly circulates all across Germany. It's actually, Luther wrote this as essentially an academic exercise. It's a debate and a challenge to an academic debate. That's what he was doing. And this is the first and only time that an academic exercise has become a runaway bestseller. Although some of us have tried unsuccessfully to repeat it. What this does is there are a lot of theological aspects that we can talk about, things like that. But what effectively happens for our purposes is a number of the states in Germany decide for various reasons that they want to adopt Luther's ideas. Others will pick up on Zwinglian stuff, particularly the city-states in the Rhineland. But what it comes down to is you begin getting a Protestant movement in many parts of Germany. And to be honest with you, the princes do this from a variety of motives. Some of them are sincerely convinced religiously. Others are doing it, frankly, for political reasons. It gets them out from under the authority of the Pope, which means that they no longer have to send money to Rome. I mean, there are all kinds of motivations here. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time was a guy named Charles V. Charles V was from the Habsburg family. He was a reform-minded Catholic. He was well aware that the Catholic Church needed reform, and he wanted to see it happen. Having said that, he was also very much uncompromisingly Catholic. And as a result, he opposed the spread of Protestant ideas inside the empire. And as a matter of fact, he tried to make it illegal. The Protestant princes ignored him. Charles would probably have tried to push the issue right away, except he had other problems to deal with. He was at war with the Turks to the east. He was at war with the French to the west. Sometimes he was at war with the Turks and the French in alliance with each other. The Catholic French are allying with the Muslim Turks because they want to stick it to the Habsburgs. And of course, as I mentioned yesterday, I believe, in 1526, he's at war with the Pope, our staunchly Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. As a quick side note, that's an important fact to keep in mind if you ever do a biography of Henry VIII. Because when Henry VIII is busy trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he appeals to the Pope, 1526. The Pope is a prisoner of Charles V, who is Catherine of Aragon's nephew. See where this goes. Anyway, so Charles has his hands full But the Protestant princes are looking at this and saying, sooner or later, things are going to simmer down. And when they do, Charles is going to come after us. So they meet together in a city called Schmalkalden and establish something called the Schmalkaldic League. This is a defensive alliance among all the Protestant princes in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, in which they agree that an attack on one of them will be considered an attack on all of them, and thus the emperor won't be able to come and pick them off one at a time. And so they figure military resistance to the emperor, if he comes after us, this is the right thing to do. It'll protect our autonomy within the empire. It'll protect Lutheranism and everything else. Great. So they send somebody to Luther telling Luther, this is what we've done. We need you to give it your blessing. Luther says, absolutely not. Not on your life. And this took him a little bit by surprise. And they asked, well, why not? And he said, Romans 13. Romans 13, obey the governing authorities, because all authority is set by God, and anyone who disobeys the ruling authority is therefore resisting God. Luther says that means that you have to obey the emperor, and if the emperor puts you in a situation where you can't obey him because it would violate God's law, you engage in civil disobedience and accept the consequences. This was not the answer the princes wanted. So they did the only thing that made sense. They sent in the lawyers because they figured there's got to be a way of arguing Luther into reason. I mean, after all, this is about saving his Reformation. And the lawyers approached Luther and said, okay, Martin, your point on Romans 13 is rather well taken, but there are a couple of things you haven't taken into account. First of all, the Holy Roman Emperor is an elected office. 7 princes, called the electors, elect the Holy Roman Emperor. Since they are the ones who elect him, it is their responsibility to oversee him. That's part of the legal structure of the Holy Roman Empire. And this applies particularly to the electors, but also to the other princes in the empire. If the emperor violates his word or breaks the law, they have a duty legally to resist him. Further, as I mentioned earlier today, I believe, these princes are part of the powers that be. They are part of the governing authorities. As part of the governing authorities, they have responsibilities, and they are also appointed by God to their positions. So for all these reasons, Martin, the Schmalkaldic League is perfectly legal, and if it's legal, then presumably it ought to be theologically justifiable. Luther considered their arguments, and he concluded that they were right. And so in the year, it's either 1530 or 1531, we actually know when it happened, but dating in this period, when years begin, is a little bit difficult. In many parts of Europe, the year begins on Easter, and since Easter moves around, you might have one year where there are 2 March 31sts and another year where there are none. So depending on how you're dating it, it's either 1530 or 1531. That's what it kind of comes down to, if you're using modern dating. But in any event, Luther issues something called the Torgau Memorandum, something nobody seems to know anything about. I can't even find an article on it online, but it's a really important document. Because in the Torgau Memorandum, what Luther says is, okay, if the lawyers' arguments are correct about the legal structure, the constitution, as it were, of the Holy Roman Empire, then resistance is theologically acceptable. It's legal, therefore it is theologically okay, because it is within the structure of the powers that be, the governing authorities. What this means in practice is that what Luther is saying is that within the Holy Roman Empire, the lesser magistrates or the inferior magistrates, the people who are part of the government in a lower office, have the right to resist people in the higher office, the superior magistrate, if they break their word or violate the law in a substantial way. Private individuals have no right of resistance. But if a lesser magistrate leads the resistance, then the private individual can join. They don't have a right to do this on their own initiative. Now, when we talk about resistance here, we're not talking about civil disobedience or anything of the sort. In this case, when we're talking resistance theory, again, as I think I mentioned earlier, it means taking up arms and physically or violently resisting, using force against the emperor if he tries to impose something. So this is the beginning of Protestant resistance theory. Its initial form has to do with the specific legal structure of the Holy Roman Empire, and it emphasizes particularly the doctrine of lesser magistrates. That is to say, it's the lesser magistrate that has the right to lead resistance against superior magistrates in, well, frankly, kind of extreme circumstances. Now, I know I did this last night, but I think it bears repeating. Luther's reaction to the proposal initially is based fundamentally on Romans 13. And today, as we are looking at people who are questioning whether, as Christians, it is right or appropriate or necessary for us to obey government mandates, the most commonly cited passage is Romans 13. You also get some from 1 Peter. Everybody agrees that there are times when it is appropriate to disobey the government. Think about Peter with the Sanhedrin. You judge whether it's right for us to obey God rather than man. The sort of what I would describe as the minimalist answer to this question is, if the government commands us to do something that is forbidden in Scripture or forbids us to do something that is commanded in Scripture, then we have to disobey. We obey God rather than the government. And that's absolutely true. However, once again, the core question here extends far beyond just individual commands. Nowhere in Scripture, well, let's put it this way. Once again, let's go back to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. Okay. The question that we always have to come back to is what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. If you get nothing else out of what I'm telling you this weekend, remember that. That is the fundamental question that we have to ask with respect to obedience or disobedience to government. A second question we can ask is, what is the purpose of government? And the two of them are obviously closely related. The question of what belongs to Caesar is not, or God, is not as simple, I don't think, as what is expressly commanded or forbidden. That's certainly part of it. It includes, though, a lot more. It includes things like unalienable rights. The government does not have a right to deprive you of life, liberty, or property. Keyword being arbitrarily there. It includes conscience. The government does not have authority over your conscience. It includes particularly religious liberty. The government does not have the authority to dictate what you believe or how you worship. And not only how you worship, the government does not have the authority to dictate how you live out your faith in your daily life. Freedom of religion is not freedom of worship. That's a rhetorical sleight of hand that has been done frequently by candidates who are trying to limit religious freedom to just what you do Sunday morning. Obedience to God extends more than just obedience to his explicit commands. And when the government oversteps into that area, it is not only our right, but our responsibility before God to say thus far and no further. No, we will not go there. And then again, there is the issue that I talked about quite a bit yesterday. What is the purpose of government? Both Romans 13 and 1 Peter tell us it's to reward the good and punish the evil. If government regulations don't do that, if they're not really about rewarding good and punishing evil, then we have a right to question whether or not the government is actually doing what it's supposed to do. This again ties into the issue I talked about last time of sphere sovereignty, those kinds of things. When a government tries to tell a sphere how to do its job, it's overstepping. Now, not all overstepping of government by government requires any kind of resistance, but we should at least take note of it, and maybe it's appropriate to protest it. But Romans 13 is not a blank check for the government to tell us what to do with only a few exceptions. It's really what it comes down to. Now, so we have this situation where this idea of resistance by the lesser magistrate is promoted by Luther through the Torgau Memorandum. It then becomes the foundation for the theological justification, not only of the Schmalkaldic League, but it then spreads to other Protestant territories, particularly those that are facing active persecution on the part of a Catholic government. And the idea of resistance by the lesser magistrate, resistance led by the lesser magistrate, is then adopted pretty much by continental Protestants across the board. So the Huguenots in France, who are facing wars of religion against the Catholic monarchy, the wars of religion in France follow a cycle, and they start in 1563 and continue arguably into the next century, but certainly until the 1590s. The cycle is there's a provocation that causes the Huguenots, the Protestants, to mobilize their forces. A war of religion breaks out. After a while, both sides get exhausted, and depending on how well the Huguenots did on the battlefield, they're either granted more or fewer rights to meet for worship. There's a temporary break, there's another provocation, and rinse and repeat. It just keeps happening over and over again. And the justification for it fundamentally is that the resistance to the king is led by the princes. There are a number of princes, including members of the royal family, who are Protestant. And since they are leading the resistance against the king, this is justified. We see this in lots of Huguenot political treatises, including the Vindiciae contra Tyrannus, which we have a copy of out there, in which, that's the one I talked about earlier today, in which there's this idea that there are two different covenants in place. The covenant between God and the nation, and the covenant between the king and the people. When the king violates either of these covenants, the Vindiciae argues, then it is the duty of the lesser magistrates to lead resistance against the king. It is not only an option, it is an objective duty. And furthermore, it is also the duty of these princes to support resistance in other countries when parallel situations occur. I think that's an appeal for help for the Huguenots. So the point being, this idea of resistance by the lesser magistrates becomes a sort of staple of Protestant justification for their continued existence in the face of Catholic nations that want to exterminate them. It's used in the Netherlands, it's used in France, it's used in the Holy Roman Empire, and so on. The one place it isn't really used directly is in Britain. Many British theorists, political theorists, will use the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, but some of them take it a step further. Resistance is justified within sort of the Calvinist world. Resistance is justified when the ruler breaks the covenant. Remember, there's this idea of the covenant between the king and the people. When the king breaks the covenant, resistance is justified. Probably not as a first step. You want to protest, you want to do other things, you want to try to move the king in a different direction. But if it doesn't work, you can resist. The British, however, point out that the covenant that is established is not between the king and the lesser magistrates, it's between the king and the people. Thus, the violation of the covenant, thus the people, as the one who are harmed by the violation of the covenant, have a direct right of resistance. You don't need the lesser magistrate. Since the violation of the covenant affects the people, they are the ones that have the right to resist. It's a much more radical idea about resistance than what you see on the continent. The continent is all lesser magistrate. In Britain, many key figures are going to argue, no, it's not the lesser magistrate, it's the people who have the responsibility. And that's going to really shape a lot of things that happen in British politics. So we see this, for example, starting, let me just give you a quick thumbnail sketch of British history here. It starts, for our purposes, with Charles I. Queen Elizabeth had been the end of the Tudor dynasty. She designated James Stuart, the King of Scotland, as her heir. He's her closest relative, so that made sense. And sort of by normal laws of succession, you would have expected it to go that way. James Stuart was James VI of Scotland, becomes James I of England. So it's sometimes listed James VI/1 as his designation. James had been brought up as a Presbyterian, but he absolutely hated them. Didn't want to have anything to do with the Presbyterians. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, which I'm not going to get into. But he actually will end up commissioning the King James Bible, and he does that because he wants to undermine the Geneva Bible, which was the common Bible that was available at the time in English. The Geneva Bible included a lot of Calvinist study notes, and James wanted to get rid of those. So he commissions the King James Bible, the authorized version, to replace the Geneva Bible. It takes a while, but it does eventually stick. And in general, what he really wanted was a church with bishops running it. He didn't like the sort of Republican state of the church in Presbyterianism. As a matter of fact, when he was encouraged by the English Puritans to adopt Presbyterianism in England and get rid of the bishops, his response was, no bishops, no king. Now that may seem a little bit odd, but let me explain that because once again, it's going to become relevant a little later on. According to Aristotle, there are three basic forms of government. You've got monarchy, ruled by a sole individual. You have aristocracy, ruled by a group of people. And you have, its positive form is a republic, ruled by representation. Each of them has strengths and weaknesses. Each of them also is a degenerate form. The degenerate form of a monarchy is a tyranny. The degenerate form of an aristocracy is an oligarchy. And the degenerate republic is a democracy. That's Aristotle. Aristotle lived in Athens, which was a democracy. He knew what he was talking about. But anyway, what you see happening in the Reformation is that the form of government adopted by the churches parallels the form of government of the state. So in Lutheran territories, where you've got a prince, you have government in the state by bishops. It's a monarchical principle. Where you have republics like the city-states like Geneva, they adopt a republican form of government. For King James, having a king with a republican church, well, that's going to lead to undermining the monarchy. No bishop, no king. Now keep in mind those three forms of government. We'll get to them again. James dies, passes his throne on to his son Charles I. Charles had as his archbishop a guy by the name of William Laud. William Laud described himself as a moderate Calvinist. That is somewhat like President Biden describing himself as a moderate Republican. Laud was anything but a Calvinist. He was really taken with the idea of the beauty of holiness, which means that he liked liturgy, he liked incense, he liked robes and vestments and things like that. And while there had been some of this even under Elizabeth, under Laud it went considerably further. And Charles wanted to enforce this across his entire kingdom, which includes both England and Scotland. When Laud's new prayer book was introduced in Edinburgh, there were riots. They didn't like this popish prayer book. And to quell the riots, no king is willing to tolerate riots because a riot is one step short of full-scale rebellion. The king sent the English army north to Edinburgh to put down the riots. The Scots raised their own army and drove the English back into England. Now, at this point, Charles had already been in sort of a tug of war for power with Parliament. Only Parliament in England can raise taxes. And Charles needed money to fight the war. So he had to summon Parliament to try to get the money to do this. Now, here's another interesting fact that most people don't realize. England at this time the educated classes in England were dominated almost completely by Puritans. When we read about Elizabethan England and things like that, frequently you know this as the world of Shakespeare and the Elizabethan Renaissance and things like that. The fact of the matter is, they were no more mainstream than theater is in our country today. The fact is that there were about a dozen different Puritan authors who all by themselves outsold the entire production of the Elizabethan Renaissance in terms of printed works. Puritanism was mainstream. And the Puritans controlled Parliament. This was what the elites believed. This is what the elites were interested in. And so the Puritans now had Charles over a barrel. They could start trying to insist on religious reforms of the sort that they wanted in order to agree to give Charles the money he needed to fight the Scots. Now, of course, the Puritans in Parliament kind of liked the Scots because they were all good Calvinists. Well, Charles didn't exactly like this, and long story short, you get the English Civil War, which features Parliament and the Scots on one side, and the so-called Cavaliers, a lot of the nobility with Charles on the other. And there are a lot of ups and downs, but in the end, Charles is beheaded. He is arrested, he's captured, put on trial as a traitor, and then beheaded. His sons, Charles and James, go into exile to France. And a commonwealth is created in England. The Commonwealth is headed by Oliver Cromwell. Not going to go into that. Cromwell was somewhat of a disappointment to the Puritans. He was a lot more open-minded than a lot of them wanted to be, at least among Protestants. Didn't want any Catholics, but among Protestants, he was actually reasonably tolerant. The Irish to this day absolutely hate Cromwell because he didn't like Catholics, and he did a lot of very bad things in Ireland as a result. But when Oliver Cromwell was actually a very capable ruler in many ways, but when he died, his son Richard was going to step in as Lord Protector. They didn't want a king. He was going to step in as Lord Protector, but Richard was nowhere near as competent as as Oliver. And so the army gets together and they decide to begin negotiating with Charles I's son, Charles II, to return to England in what's known as the Restoration. Now, we need to pause here for a moment because we have to take a look at what's going on in France during this period, because Charles and his brother James are brought up in the court of the King of France, Louis XIV. Louis XIV came to the throne in 1643. He died in 1715. He was on the French throne for 72 years. Louis had been taught statecraft by a man named Mazarin, who in turn had learned it from a guy named Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu. And they were big believers in absolutism. And when Louis came to the throne, he was going to rule as an absolute monarch. What he said goes, period, in all areas, no question. And Louis was actually quite capable, for the most part, in terms of being a ruler. To put Louis in perspective, his attitude, at one point he was quoted as having said, well, the French is l'État, c'est moi, which means roughly the state, it's me. I am the state. You know, that's Louis's attitude. And the very existence, now the Huguenots by this point were legalized in France. There was a thing called the Edict of Nantes that went into place in 1598 that allowed the Huguenots freedom to worship and to meet and so on within certain parameters. Louis believed, however, that the very existence of a religious minority in his kingdom called into question his absolute power. And so even though the Edict of Nantes had all kinds of guarantees for Huguenot protection, Louis began persecuting the Huguenots, putting a lot of pressure on them, and eventually so many of them were forced to return to Catholicism that in 1685 he declared the Edict of Nantes no longer necessary because there were no Protestants left in France, and he revoked it, making Protestantism illegal. There were actually about 1 million Protestants in the country. That's the court in which Charles and James basically grew up. With the Restoration, Charles II returns to England. One of the things that he does almost immediately is get a series of laws passed. He gets this actually through Parliament without much objection, that reestablishes the Church of England with all its bishops and rituals and things like that as the state religion and outlaws everything else. He arrests Puritan leaders, and if you're a dissenter, you're likely to be arrested and sent into exile. I'm from New Jersey, so a quick story here. There were a group of Scots who wanted to continue worshiping as Presbyterians. Under Charles, they were arrested, they were actually tortured, and then they were sent as slaves to the Caribbean. On the way to the Caribbean, however, they managed to take over the ship and landed it in New Jersey. And there, the Dutch Reformed community that had settled there welcomed them. They established a church called Old Tenant Church, that's what it's known as today because this was the Tennant family. And that group of Scots settled in this area. And when the American Revolution hit, guess which side they were on? You have real oppression of these other groups. And this is going to have a long-term effect because what occurs in England during this time is that it becomes very, very, well, it's just not done to be too engaged with your religious faith. You know, you bring your babies to church to get them baptized. They grow up, they get confirmed, they go to communion. You go to church Sundays. When it's time for them to get married, they get married. They bring their babies to be baptized. When they die, they're buried in the churchyard, and that's it. It's a formal religion. It's a thing that you do, but they don't really want anybody getting too enthusiastic about their religion because, well, they're afraid of another civil war, frankly. They're afraid that if you do this, it's going to be a repeat of the Puritans. So that's the situation. Now, as you're moving forward through the 17th century, Charles dies, and his younger brother, James, comes to the throne. Now, there's a problem here. Charles was Anglican. He had no problem with that. James is Catholic. He had converted to Catholicism in France. He was married to a Catholic woman. Now, England, since the time of Elizabeth, had had a long history of dealing with problems with Catholicism. The great enemy of Queen Elizabeth had been Spain, whose monarch, Philip II, had as one of his titles, the most Catholic king. By the way, most of the stuff you hear about the Spanish Inquisition is Elizabethan propaganda. They did their utmost to paint the Spanish as evil and tyrannical and so on. The next great Catholic monarch is Louis XIV. What is he doing? He's busy persecuting the Protestants. He's busy outlawing Protestantism. So the people of England and people in Parliament are really nervous. They may not be too excited about religion. They may not think that you should be too active in your faith, but they're really worried about having a Catholic king. They saw what happened in Spain. They saw what happened in France. They don't want it happening in England. It doesn't help that Charles begins appointing illegally Catholics to high position in his government. Parliament had prohibited that practice, but Charles went ahead and did it anyway. And then he committed the unpardonable sin. He got an heir. He had a son. And once he did that, you have a Catholic monarch violating the law, putting Catholic people in positions of authority, and now we've got a Catholic heir. Well, we've got to do something about this. And so in an event called the Glorious Revolution, Parliament invites James's daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, two staunch Protestants, to come to England to take the throne. James, in a panic, flees London, takes the royal seal and throws it in the Thames River, and heads out of town. Parliament says, oh, well, when he threw the seal into the river, that must have been an abdication, so he has stepped down as a throne, so what we're doing is perfectly legal. And they put William and Mary on the throne. It's called the Glorious Revolution because it was accomplished with very little bloodshed. This is then going to set up in Scotland. Well, in Scotland, the way they look at it is England's gotten rid of their king, but that doesn't mean we've gotten rid of ours, even if he's the same person. And so this sets up the Jacobite wars that you get in Scotland. But the point of all of this is that the justification for what was going on. Now, oh, by the way, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes is 1685. That's when Protestantism is declared illegal in France. The Glorious Revolution in England is 3 years later in 1688. There's a cause and effect here. Now, the justification for the Glorious Revolution, they really need some sort of legal basis for it, way beyond just we don't like Catholics, has to do, well, ultimately it is that is one of the things that inspires John Locke to write his two treatises on government. They weren't published until after the Glorious Revolution, and even then Locke published them anonymously, because these were very, very dangerous things to write. And if things had gone differently, it could have resulted in Locke's execution for treason. What Locke does in his two treatises is he unites all of the different elements that we've been talking about over the last couple of days, at least I've been talking about, into a single coherent political system. So, for example, unalienable rights. Neither Luther nor Calvin talked in those terms. Locke brings that in from medieval theologians. He takes resistance theory from Luther. He takes covenantal theories of government as interpreted by the British into his system. And he comes up with a coherent system for understanding government that draws together all of these various strands of Christian political theology that had been developing over the past 1,000 years. So what he says is that people have certain unalienable rights that are given to them by government. These include life, liberty, and property. That should sound familiar. Medieval theologians had argued exactly the same thing. Government exists to protect those rights. That is the specific purpose of government, is to protect the unalienable rights of the people. And the people then establish a covenant, well, he calls it a contract with the government to defend these rights. The government will be set up in such a way that the people will agree to certain responsibilities to the government will agree to certain responsibilities to the people, but these always include protecting their unalienable rights. When the government violates these rights, when it breaks its side of the contract by taking the rights away from the people, then the people have the right to revoke the contract, since the government has broken it already, and establish a contract with a new government that they think will be more suitable to their needs, their interests, their desires. So what we see here is a drawing together again of all of these different elements. He uses contract rather than covenant, in part because, well, like I said, it's more of a secularized version, but in part it's because the way contracts work, if one side violates the contract, the other side is no longer bound. It's not clear that covenants work exactly the same way. So Locke wrote this. There are a couple of reasons for it, but part of it is it provides a theoretical justification for the Glorious Revolution. Because you see, in the British mind, Catholicism equals tyranny. Therefore, a Catholic monarch with a Catholic heir is an imminent threat to liberty. And thus, we're justified in removing the Catholic monarch. One of the first things that happens after the Glorious Revolution is there's an Edict of Toleration passed, which says that Trinitarian Protestants are free to worship in England. So it actually expands the range of acceptable religions within England beyond just the Church of England. So it grants a much broader degree of religious toleration. And also the Bill of Rights, which establishes the rights of Parliament. So you get, at this point, a true constitutional monarchy develops. Now, all of this is, interesting history, but it has a direct bearing on the founding of the United States. Locke, by the way, by background, Locke had been a Puritan, but he was influenced by some of the early Enlightenment debates on Scripture to adopt a more kind of liberal theological outlook. So he has a certain degree of respect for the Bible, but also a certain degree of skepticism about it, and he's hardly really orthodox at this point. But nonetheless, his thought ends up shaping a lot of what happens within the United States. In fact, if you want to see a great summary of Locke's ideas in a single very long sentence, if it's punctuated correctly, read the prologue to the Declaration of Independence. Particularly starting with the sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." After that, there's a series of that's. And usually what you see is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, period. It's not a period in the original, it's a comma, or as we would put it, a semicolon. Because there's a whole series of other that's that follow. And those other that's that follow are also part of the self-evident truths that Jefferson is talking about. And if you read that whole sentence, it's essentially a nearly perfect summary of Locke's thinking. So that's how significant Locke is for Jefferson. Now, there's one rather obvious change that takes place in the Declaration of Independence, and that's that rather than life, liberty, and property, Jefferson has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, what's going on there? Property is included, yes. Pursuit of happiness. Now, this is kind of obscure, but the word happiness does not mean to Jefferson what it means to us. Jefferson is reflecting on Aristotle at this point. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which talks about the among other things, the fundamental purpose of human life. The fundamental purpose of human life is to achieve what he calls in Greek eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a state of how to describe this? It's a life well lived. It's a life that is good and satisfying on all levels. It goes way beyond superficial happiness to the point where you can, when you are on your deathbed and you look back on your life, you can say, yeah, that was right, I did that right. Which obviously involves more than money, it involves more than experiences and all this kind of thing. It's a life, to Aristotle, it's a life of virtue, it's a life of excellence. Eudaimonia is translated into 18th century English as happiness. So what he is saying is we have an unalienable right to pursue the very purpose of human existence, which is to achieve this state of eudaimonia. We can pursue it. There's no guarantee we'll get it, but we can pursue it. Now, to Jefferson, this included property, because in order to achieve eudaimonia, and actually even in order to develop virtue, you needed property. And by property, to Jefferson, he is thinking of agricultural property. He's looking at yeoman farmers, people who own their own land, and so on. Because it's in that context that you learn prudence, you learn hard work, you learn all of these other things that contribute to virtue. Jefferson didn't think much of urban dwellers. He referred to people in the city as the swinish masses. His words, not mine. And he doubted that they would ever have the virtue needed to govern themselves, because that can only be achieved by working your own land with your own hands. That's what produces virtue, which is essential to eudaimonia. So he sort of sneaks property rights into the back door via this concept of eudaimonia and how that works out within his thought. So what we have here then is Jefferson gives us a great summary of Locke as part of the introduction to the Declaration of Independence. And then the rest of the Declaration of Independence shows all the ways that King George III violated the unalienable rights of the colonies, which then justified them dumping him and putting in a government more suitable to their desires, that they believe would be more capable of protecting their interests. So that's really the justification for the American Revolution. It comes, in the Declaration at least, straight out of Locke. Locke, in turn, is the synthesis of a lot of elements of Christian political theology that we put in place over the last couple of lectures. I would argue, frankly, that the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution, I'll say a bit about that in a second, is actually the culmination in many ways of Christian political theology. Now, as far as the Constitution goes, I'll skip the Articles of Confederation. As far as the Constitution goes, what we see there is once again what we saw in the Middle Ages, this union of Augustine and Aristotle. Augustine, you will recall, believed that because of original sin, no one can be trusted with absolute power. Augustine was a heavy influence on Luther and Calvin. From Calvin, Augustine was a heavy influence on the Puritans. And this is where the American tradition of distrust of government comes from. It comes from Augustine via Calvin and the Puritans. But at the same time, we have Aristotle's theories of government. Remember Aristotle's three types of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and republic? The ideal system, according to Aristotle's followers, would be a system that, since each of them has strengths and weaknesses, an ideal system would be to combine all three into a single government, to find a way of bringing in the monarchical, aristocratic, and republican principles into a single government. It's called a mixed state. So what do the people in the Constitution do? They take the monarchical principle and put it into the presidency. They take the aristocratic principle and put it in the Senate. They take the Republican principle and put it in the House of Representatives. The very fact that it's called the House of Representatives points out that it's Republican. A republic is government through representation. So what they did is they created an Aristotelian mixed state. And then the judiciary is off on the side, and their job is to play traffic cop. Okay? Make sure that or better yet, not traffic cop, let's call it referee, to make sure that the three branches work together. Jefferson, by the way, never trusted the Supreme Court. He said that what it did is it made the Constitution a nose of wax. You could take it and twist it and make it anything you wanted. So he never really trusted it. But in terms of the three, elected branches of government, what you're seeing is the Aristotelian categories of government put in place in our government. And they knew very well what they were doing. They all knew their Aristotle. So where does Augustine come in? Augustine comes in because there's a system of checks and balances put in place. The assumption is that if the Senate gets too big for its britches, the House and the President will step in and make sure it doesn't overstep its proper bounds. If it's the House that does it, the Senate and the President will do it. If it's the President that does it, it'll be the House and the Senate that do it. The idea being that each of the branches of government has its own interests. We're trying to use original sin against itself here. They have their own interests, and they will jealously guard their prerogatives. They're not going to let any other branch of government overstep its bounds and take power away from them. So each of them will keep a watchful eye on the other, and they will double team the one that starts taking power, too much power, that starts assuming responsibilities that aren't given to it in the Constitution. The idea is that loyalty to the institution will keep people watching what's going on to make sure, well, to guard their own power, frankly. So again, we want to use original sin against itself. We want to use the tendency of people to want to accumulate power to get them to watch out against somebody else encroaching on their rights. Okay, that's the idea. That's literally what they are trying to do. What they were really worried about is the development of factions. All the way back in the Middle Ages, everybody recognized, going all the way back to the Italian city-states, they recognized that factions were the death of republics. Because if a faction develops, the faction will work for its own interests rather than the interests of the city, and the people who are on the losing side will basically get the shaft. It's really what it comes down to. Factions destroy republics, and the founders knew this. This is an established fact. Just like you need virtue for a republic, you need to avoid or prevent factions from developing. This is why the original Constitution did not include provisions for political parties. The way the Constitution was originally written, the president was the guy who got the most electoral votes, the vice president was the guy who got the second most electoral votes. So right now we would have President Biden and Vice President Trump. Simply saying that illustrates the problem. It was even worse when it was President Trump and Vice President Clinton. Okay, so because this obviously would not work, one of the first amendments to the Constitution was to say that you elect the president and the vice president together on a slate. And what this does is it, well, functionally creates political parties right away. And the danger of political parties, what the founders were really concerned with, is the system of checks and balances as it is set up depends on people's primary loyalty being to the institution. The representatives to the House, the senators to the Senate, the president to the presidency. That's where their primary loyalty lies. If you have political parties, the loyalty goes to the party and it crosses institutional lines. So that what happens is you will get a system where the checks and balances do not work as intended because loyalties cross those institutional lines, and thus people are not paying attention to the proper boundaries. They are doing what it takes to advance their party's interest, not to protect the system. That's what the founders were afraid of, and that's what we've gotten. Sometimes actually going back and reading the history can get really depressing because they all knew what was going to happen. They all knew what would happen if things went in this direction. But there was no really obvious way of stopping it in order to make the system work. So that's where we leave things right now, except for, well, the coda. I said that the Constitution and the Declaration are sort of the culmination, already beginning to move in a slightly secular direction, the culmination of a lot of Christian political theology. The reason why it doesn't develop further has to do with events occurring across the pond. In 1789, there's a little tiff in France known as the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was the antithesis of what I've been talking about here. The Enlightenment philosophes in France, the leaders of Enlightenment thought, had by this point so thoroughly critiqued and satirized the French government that the revolution ended up being inevitable. But in France, church and state were very, very deeply intertwined. And to take out the government, you also needed to take out the church. And so what you see emerging in France is an attempt at a purely secular revolution that self-consciously rejected anything connected to the past. It rejected ultimately monarchy, although initially it was going for a constitutional monarchy. It rejected that. It rejected the church. It rejected any influence on Christianity or Christian thought on the government. All of these kinds of things. And due to a number of mistakes they made, it ultimately led to a guy by the name of Maximilien Robespierre, who was a disciple of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Those of you who listen to the podcast will know what's coming. And that resulted in the terror. In one location in Paris, now known rather euphemistically as the Place de la Concorde, the place of agreement, the place of peace, they executed 1,961 people on the guillotine, including Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And that's just one location in Paris. The results of this attempt at a purely secular revolution killed well over 100,000 people in France alone. And yet, oddly enough, as bad as the French Revolution was, the effect of the French Revolution is to reset political theory. From that point on, political theory is no longer being built around Christian political theology. You no longer are getting people influenced by medieval ideas of unalienable rights or covenants or even resistance theory, any of these kinds of things that had been so developed over so many centuries in Christianity, they get dropped by the wayside. And instead, what we get is a purely secularized vision of what politics is. And it's really a product of the revolution, the French Revolution, which changes the entire way, like I said, the entire field thinks about politics from this point on. I would suggest that one of the things that, as Christians, we need to do that is extraordinarily difficult in a society that is as thoroughly secularized as ours is we need to think about how we can start recovering some of these core elements of Christian political theology. And if we do, we have at least the potential of creating a more compelling vision for society and for how it should work than what society is offering us now, which frankly is leading very rapidly into the realm of chaos, confusion, and frankly, anarchy. That's something that, as believers, we have the potential to do. Again, I quoted Hans Scholl last night. I am German and I am Christian, therefore I am responsible for Germany. We are Christians and we are Americans, therefore we are responsible for America. Thank you.